Welcome to our final event of 2021, which happens also to be the opening event of a series that will run until July next year on culture, conflict and recovery in Asia. We had planned to hold this event at the Aga Khan Centre in London with the generous support of the Aga Khan Foundation. But as with so much in the last 2 years, plans have had to be changed in the face of the coronavirus pandemic. So we are delighted that so many of you had planned to join us in London today are with us online instead. I first saw what could be done with cultural heritage in a development context in Afghanistan in 2006. I was at the beginning of a diplomatic posting and my staff told me that I ought to see what the Aga Khan Trust for Culture and Rory Stewart's newly launched Turquoise Mountain Foundation were doing. I was impressed by what I saw. When David Miliband visited the following year, I took him to see it, and he was impressed too. So when Jonathan Ryder of Aleph Strategies asked if the RSAA would be open to collaborating on the role that cultural heritage can play in development, I was enthusiastic, and the series that we are starting today is the product of almost a year of joint work. Alongside events that you've been accustomed to see from the RSAA, over the next 8 months, we will be delivering events on specific aspects of the overall theme of culture, conflict and recovery in Asia. But today it's a huge pleasure to open the series with Rory Stewart as our speaker. And in the audience are the other two people who showed me around the old city and Babur's gardens in Kabul 15 years ago, Jolene Leslie and Deborah Dunham. I'm very pleased that they are all here. Jonathan Ryder will introduce the work of Aleph Strategies and this series. Matt Reed, who had expected to be our host at the Aga Khan Centre in London, will say a few words about their work in this area, and we will then welcome Rory Stewart. Rory is well known for his books and his time as a Member of Parliament and Minister in the governments of David Cameron and Theresa May, a political career that ended in 2019 with Boris Johnson's election to the leadership of the Conservative Party. He is now a Senior Fellow at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale University. Rory will take questions at the end, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if there is something that you would like to ask. But for now, I will hand over to Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Michael, for the introduction. We're here to launch a series of lectures that explore the role of culture in post-emergency recovery and development. For those who don't know me, I'm a co-founder of Aleph Strategies. We're a research company that helps NGOs, governments and businesses deliver aid and development programs in conflict-affected countries and frontier markets. We've evaluated education programs in healthcare, education, civil society, economic development. But the programs that really stand out to us, those that have really made a difference on individual lives, have been those that support culture. Whether you're restoring ancient monuments in Afghanistan or funding experimental ethno-jazz festivals in Central Asia, these are the programs that we've seen making a lasting contribution to social and economic recovery. However, culture is often overlooked by international funders and aid organizations as a means for development. It's often seen as a luxury compared to other needs like food, shelter, education and healthcare. But as these talks will show, culture can have a powerful and transformative effect on post-emergency recovery. Though it's an overused term, I think culture can be used as a springboard for broader development goals. This lecture series will take place against a broader conversation amongst policymakers and academics about the contribution of culture to the Sustainable Development Goals, that list of global objectives for making the world a better place. The aim of these lectures is to enrich those discussions by inviting practitioners working in post-conflict and emergency countries to share their experiences and ideas. We really wanted to create a platform for conversations between those who work in development and humanitarian aid, those who work in culture, and those who work in the places in between. Our message is pretty simple: fund more cultural programs. So over the course of the next year, we're going to be hearing from some really great organizations who are pioneering exciting projects that work with the grain of culture to help communities recover from the effects of disaster, whether civil war, insurgencies, tsunamis or drought. We'll be joined by UNESCO, who will be talking about the importance of culture in a humanitarian response scenario based on their experiences in Lombok after the earthquakes struck the island in 2018. We're going to be hearing, of course, from the Turquoise Mountain Foundation, who'll be speaking about the power of cultural heritage and development programs in Afghanistan and Jordan. The Overseas Development Institute will be speaking about the role of culture in engaging with non-state actors and armed opposition groups. The Aga Khan Cultural Service will be talking a lot about their work on the benefits of restoring historic sites and cities, primarily in Syria, but elsewhere too. We'll be hearing from Community Jamil, whose collaboration with the World Health Organization in Syria is using culture as a means to deal with post-conflict trauma in Iraq. The Prince Claus Fund will be speaking about community-led culture programs in Lebanon following the devastating blast in 2020. And we'll also be joined by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, a big global funder of cultural programs, who will be talking about why donors should be spending and investing in culture. We'll also be hearing from a truly innovative cultural exchange program by Eric Latsky, who brought the New York Philharmonic Orchestra to North Korea and the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, comprising young Israelis, Palestinians, and other Arab musicians, to the US. Later in the series, we'll be joined too by the British Council and ICOMOS, and we hope as the event gathers momentum that others will join in too. Our first talk will be on the 2nd of February by Mo Saito from the Institution of Migration in Iraq, and she'll be talking to us about IOM's experiences using sport and culture for peace-building programs and social cohesion programming. We really hope you'll join us for all these conversations. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Matt Reed for an overview of the Aga Khan's work before we hear from Rory Stewart. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Michael. I mean, my original role was to welcome all of you to the Aga Khan Center in London, and instead I'm welcoming you to my dining room and living room. So it's not quite the same. I hope that we will have an occasion to welcome many of you in person to the center, and that's something we're very much looking forward to next year. I wanted to say just a little bit about why it is that the Aga Khan group is so interested in and invested in culture. And the reason is quite simple. We are a collection of 10 development agencies working in Central and South Asia, Eastern Africa, a bit in the Middle East, and in Western Africa. Across those 10 agencies, we're focused on economic, social, and cultural development. We try to do 3 things across all of that work. We want to improve the quality of life in all its dimensions. We want to promote pluralism, and we want to enhance civil society and self-reliance. And as His Highness the Aga Khan began articulating his vision now 60 plus years ago, a core pillar of that was culture. And the reason is that he has always talked about culture as what he calls a trampoline for development, a vector for development. We believe that it is a place for the meeting of different cultures. So when we think about pluralism and when we think about the places where we're engaged, often they are places where different faiths, backgrounds met, congregated, learned about one another. And so our engagement in those historic sites is a way of continuing that legacy and bringing attention to them. But I think more importantly, it's that we also have, or as importantly, I should say, is we have a view that culture is a resource for development in the same way that natural resources are, or other kinds of attributes of economies can be. So one of the things that we always focus on is the way that culture, cultural restoration, et cetera, can anchor jobs, livelihoods, and dignity, frankly. And so across all of our work, this is something that we strive to integrate. And so as we think about culture as a kind of platform or trampoline for development, we've now been engaged in the restoration of over 350 monuments and cultural sites. We've won about 13 UNESCO Heritage Awards. And across all of that work, it's not only about the restoration. Equally important has been a community-centered development approach to the restoration work. So what you have, for example, in the work that we've done in, say, Delhi, this is a project, the restoration of Humayun's tomb. and a number of monuments in the Nizamuddin Basti area started 25 years ago. And the idea was to use the restoration of Humayun's tomb as an anchor for development of the Nizamuddin Basti and the people in that area, both to help provide training so that you had a new generation of craftspeople, so that you had a layering of educational programs, microfinance, a layering of health and social welfare programs, so that people saw culture, this restoration project, as a vector for their own development. They invest themselves in it, and therefore it really becomes a fabric of the neighborhood, but also a pathway, frankly, an economic pathway. Getting people invested in culture is a way of ensuring that there's a strong community base for maintaining it. And that is an approach that you would see in all of our restoration work, whether it's in Afghanistan, India, Syria, Egypt, Cairo, etc. And so without belaboring the point, I simply want to say that for us, Jonathan's message about investing in culture, not forgetting culture and development, couldn't be more important. I think, so with that said, I want to hand the floor over to Rory to tell us about his engagement with this work in Afghanistan and other places, and simply to say, we look forward to welcoming you another time.
Well, thank you all very, very much indeed for having me. And I'm sorry that we're not all together in person. This is a huge issue, and it's a great privilege to be called in to start to frame some of the issues that hopefully we're going to get into in more depth over the next half a dozen or dozen sessions. But I wanted to start framing the basic issue around culture, conflict, and development. And in particular, to situate the question of why it is so difficult to do. And that's going to be talking a little bit about how culture is destroyed and the ways in which it's destroyed, but also a little bit about the history of international development, the way in which we think about working with other people's countries. So I'm going to begin, if I can, with a few images, and then I'm going to try to end with a few solutions. So here are some images coming, hopefully. 1 second. So clearly, the classic images when we consider the question of culture and conflict are, of course, images like this. This is a photograph taken as the Taliban dynamited the Buddhas of Bamiyan. A very, very challenging thing to do, in fact. It turned out that they had to put a lot of energy into it. They tried firing at it. They tried different types of dynamite. This went on for some days before they finally got the calculation right to destroy these extraordinary statues, which were the last legacy of a part of central Afghanistan when it will have felt like Lhasa, one of the great Buddhist capitals of the world. You can imagine a valley not just dominated since the 8th century by these beautiful Buddhas, but also surrounded by monasteries, by caves with beautiful illumination, and indeed monks in saffron robes, Chinese travelers coming through, and the entire story of the transmission of Buddhism through Asia, anchored on this and destroyed, of course, in 2001. Or, of course, we think about this. This is a famous image from Palmyra. This is ISIS beginning to think about tackling the temple in Palmyra. And in these images, we are looking at something, of course, much, much older. We're frequently looking at the subject of iconoclasm, in other words, the deliberate destruction of these objects for ideological reasons. And it's not a story that starts with the actions taken by jihadist groups in the 21st century. Here in Afghanistan is the Minar-e-Jam. This is a monument built in the late 12th century, taller than Nelson's Column, about 165 feet high, and written around the shaft of the minaret, the Miriam Surah of the Quran about Mary, the mother of Jesus, and in turquoise tiles around the neck is written Sultan Ghiyasuddin Ghori Ibn Sam, King of Kings. This is a pair to the Qutub Minar in Delhi. It's was first actually seen on foot by a foreigner only in the 1950s, although of course the local Afghan population were very aware of its existence. But the oddity of it is that it stands alone. And the reason that it stands alone is that the Mongol armies of Chinggis Khan destroyed the rest of that city. This was once attached to a Great Friday Mosque, and indeed palaces and buildings surrounded it, all of which were then destroyed. And paradoxically, that's a reminder of another curious aspect of culture and conflict, which is that the people destroying these buildings often also wish to preserve elements of them, partly in order to emphasize the extent of their destruction. In other words, Chinggis Khan will have very deliberately left this minaret standing to hint at the rest of the city that would have been there before his destruction. And one of the reasons I'm quite confident in making that assertion is that he did the same thing in Bukhara. But again, famously, the story is that he left this minaret in Bukhara because he thought it was so beautiful while destroying everything else. I think it's more likely that what's happening is iconoclasts like to preserve some fragments of what was there before to remind people of their destruction. That was certainly true, I think, in this case of this 16th century Dutch church, a church in Holland destroyed in the 16th century by Protestant iconoclasts, smashing off the faces. Of course, the same visual defacement is very common at different periods in the Islamic world. And indeed, if you look at many of the artifacts in the Kabul Museum, the last time the Taliban took over, it was attacks on faces, but it's not confined to the Muslim world. When we talk, though, about culture and conflict, it is also important not to focus too much on objects. We need to think also about people. One of the most devastating impacts of the Syrian conflict has been the driving of almost all of Syria's most talented craftspeople out of the country, many of them to Turkey and Lebanon, but increasingly to Jordan, as Lebanon itself has become a difficult place to operate. This gentleman here in this picture, for example, is running a workshop now in Amman, but an enormous amount is lost in war. He lost his apprentices, he lost his workshop, he lost his tools, but perhaps most importantly of all, he lost all his markets. So he'd spent the previous 15, 20 years selling to clients around the Gulf, getting in $1 million, $1.5 million worth of sales a year. And suddenly all of that went up in smoke and he had to start again in a tiny back room of a house where he was sheltering as a refugee in Jordan and then slowly rebuild. And what he's rebuilding is not just a business, but an extraordinary tradition, which is on the verge of being lost. But, it is also important to understand that in many ways, one of the biggest challenges to the preservation of heritage and culture is not people with bombs or people with bullets, but it's in fact the mindset of the international development community and indeed modernization and development around the world. So let's just take a little glimpse of this. And in essence, international development since the Second World War has concerned itself with economic betterment and with efficiency. And fundamentally, it is led by economists. That is true whether we are looking at the developments in the 1970s, this is the Ujamaa scheme in Tanzania, or whether we are looking at this image here, which is Khrushchev opening a great energy plant in India. These moments, so energy plants in the 50s and 60s, basic needs in the 1970s, and then moving forward to the 1980s, the arrival of structural adjustment, which of course is the move to go in and bring Chicago free market economics in, privatize, let in foreign direct investment, liberalize the economy. All these major trends in international development, and indeed some others that we don't necessarily have time to deal with today, but trends in the 1970s about gender and about the environment, and later about governance in the 1990s, have very, very little to say about culture, right? Consistent throughout this entire period is that the many, many hundreds of trillions of dollars that have been spent predominantly by the wealthy countries of the global north have very rarely been spent on culture. Here is an image, for example, of a contemporary program. This is the 2021 USAID program directed at the Northern Triangle, so Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. And sure enough, security, prosperity, governance, these are the three buzzwords of the last 25 years. People dress them up in different ways. Sometimes they talk about, economic development, governance and security. Sometimes they talk about diplomacy, defense and development. It doesn't really matter what they're talking about. They're always talking about the three same things. But nowhere in this or in any of these little segments is anything really relating to the question of culture or heritage. And at the same time as the international development community hasn't really funded anything to do with culture and heritage. In fact, you might even make the argument they've done enormous amounts through many of these programs to actually destroy culture and heritage. Many of the developments within the countries in which we're working have also been immensely destructive to culture and heritage. In fact, the period since the Second World War has been a cultural extinction age. It's been an age of cultural extinction. More cultural heritage has been destroyed since the Second World War than certainly any other period in previous history. This is an image of Jerash, which is a Roman site in Jordan, one of the great Roman sites of the world, visited by Emperor Hadrian, who built a great gate there, a fantastically preserved amphitheater, a fantastically preserved hippodrome, an extraordinary temple devoted to Diana. But as you can see here, modern buildings coming right down on every side, right up against the face of the site. No attempt made over the last 30 years to impose any form of developmental planning control around this incredibly precious monument. Now, let's move now on to the positive. So against these pressures, against the pressures of conflict, against the pressures of the indifference of international development donors, and again, often the indifference of the countries concerned, there have been some extraordinary contributions suggesting what can be done. And in particular, suggesting what can be done through a very imaginative, integrated approach to development. So Matt Reed mentioned Humayun's tomb and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, and it's a very, very good example of this. So it seems on the surface, if you just look at the image, as though what they've been doing is restoring this palatial tomb. And indeed they did. They did it at very, very high quality. And it was quite an expensive project done with an enormous amount of care. But the developmental impacts of it have been extraordinary, because these kinds of projects undertaken by organizations like AKTC are not simply about buildings, they are about everything that goes around it. They are about heritage-led regeneration. So some statistics I've put up, but you can see they are educating thousands of children. Obviously, working on these buildings involves training thousands of craftspeople. It involves a clinic and waste collection and management, but it also includes a transformation of the visitor and tourism economy, right? 1,000% increase in visitors' numbers, all of which then brings in incomes to a marginalized and impoverished community that surrounds it. Michael was very kind to refer to the work that Turquoise Mountain has been doing in Afghanistan. There's a before shot and an after shot. And again, in the middle of a very difficult environment, I mean, India is one thing, Afghanistan is another, a restoration project, which eventually meant that this building then becomes educational space. The space behind it becomes a clinic. Visitor numbers go up. Investment in the businesses mean $20 million worth of craft sales coming from craftspeople in this area to the international community. Or indeed, to pay tribute to the Germans, this wonderful project in Bhaktipur in Nepal, undertaken by GIZ, where you can see not simply the buildings, sadly, actually badly affected by the earthquake, but then reconstructed again, but also there in that extraordinary image, the preservation of traditional crafts, in this case, ceramics manufacture, trades, bazaars, and a very imaginative funding scheme in GIZ in terms of getting tourism income. This again in Bamiyan, we've seen the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas, but there is also a much more positive story to be told in Bamiyan about the restoration, in this case, of a traditional caravanserai in the Bamiyan Valley and the way in which carpet weaving can contribute to that. More than 1 million women in Afghanistan work in carpet weaving. That is incomes for their families, and approached properly, it is also a transformation. Creches can be set up for their children, working conditions can be improved, and traditional and indeed contemporary designs can be connected to buyers in Europe and the United States, bringing very significant income into those communities. Or can do, provided the international development community is prepared to fund these kinds of projects, and provided the United States and its allies do not impose sanctions which prevent people from paying export tax and thus kill more than 1 million people in the carpet industry. But it's not just a question of what happens abroad, right? The same is true here. This is a picture of the Lake District. This is my friend, I apologize for its blurry image, it's my friend James Rebanks with his Herdwick sheep in the Lake District. Another UNESCO World Heritage Site, but a World Heritage Site focused on culture, not actually on landscape. The point of the site is not to preserve wilderness, but to connect to the heritage expressed in dry stone walls. In the case of James's family, a farming tradition going back to the Viking invasions of the 10th century, and indeed these Herdwick sheep, which almost certainly got off Norse ships. And the very difficult question of how you preserve small farmers in a modern world where the United Kingdom is signing trade deals with Australia and New Zealand, where sheep will be coming in considerably more cheaply than James can produce them. And the ways in which that can also contribute to biodiversity, to the nearly 11 million visitors a year that come into the Lake District, and the ways in which we think about humans and their place in cultural heritage. Final image here, which is the ancient Roman site of Gadara. This is looking down on the Sea of Galilee. So this is right facing the Golan Heights, Syria a mile away, Israel a mile away, but this is just on the edge of Jordan, a militarized zone. A zone, curiously, if you were to get out of that basilica just 100 yards down the hill, you find trenches which were dug during the 6 Days War. And you can see an enormous amount of modern munitions surrounding the site. Paradoxically, the site has actually been preserved from being wrecked because it is a military zone and the military wouldn't let anyone in. And it's actually the removal of the military presence which is likely to lead to houses being built all over this very precious place. It's another glimpse of it with a military watchtower there you can see just in the back. Looking over the site, there's an army barracks just on the corner there. So, what is the challenge? And just to get into this, what is it to frame where we're going forward? What is the challenge in terms of moving forward with these wonderful projects, of which perhaps projects like Humayun's tomb are a very powerful moving example? What stops us from doing more of this? What stops us, for example, from getting into this site here, into Gadara in Jordan, and really working with the local community? So local community in this case, 70% unemployment, enormous number of Syrian refugees, huge potential to bring them into the project, to restore it, to invest in the olive groves and the production of olive oil, to develop the traditional Roman baths, to bring visitors in, to transform the economy of northern Jordan, to create jobs, and to create sustainable tourism. Actually, you could imagine people staying in tents on the site. Why doesn't this happen? Why is it much more likely that sites like this are going to be surrounded by ill-conceived modern development and very little benefit will go to the surrounding community and gradually people will get depressed and move on? Well, it's partly because of my beautiful blue circle that I showed you earlier on, and the way in which people who produce these kinds of blue circles think about the world. Right? This blue circle is actually extremely misleading. The lovely vision of the circle gives the impression that it is holistic, that includes almost everything that a country needs. Right? This is, of course, deeply, deeply misleading. There are many, many things that are not on that circle at all. Right? If you were somebody looking at it from the perspective of 1993, you might wonder why the word democracy doesn't appear in the circle. If you were looking at it from the perspective of 2000, you might wonder why the rule of law doesn't appear in the circle. But if you're me looking at it, you wonder why the word culture doesn't really appear in the circle. And one of the problems dealing with the international community is that very few of them, the distinguished exceptions such as the Swiss and the Germans, and occasionally American embassy, ambassador cultural protection funds, but generally speaking, these agencies are allergic to the notion of investing in culture and heritage. And part of that is that the sorts of programs that we're talking about in relation, for example, to Humayun's Tomb, involve something called integration, right? These are projects of integrated development. This example of a cultural heritage program in Afghanistan involves a clinic doing maternal health care. It includes the restoration of a 19th century courtyard building, but it also includes training craftspeople. It also includes a primary school. If you were to approach the FCDO or USAID, they would say that all these things are dealt with by different departments. Right? If you want to fund education, you have to go to the education department. If you want to fund health, you go to the health department. And the scale at which they operate are 20, 30, $50 million grants, which are not suitable for funding a small primary school or a clinic that sees 27,000 patients a year. They're big framework contracts designed to rule 300 health clinics across the country, or designed to pay all the teachers' salaries the entire country in primary schools. And if they get involved in the question of vocational training, they will be trying to train 25,000 people in Helmand at a cost of $200 a head. Now, surprise, surprise, $200 a head doesn't produce a highly skilled craftsperson. In fact, it barely produces somebody who can hammer in a nail. They're then given a bunch of tools, thrown out the door 2 weeks' time, and everybody gets a nice tick in the box saying we've vocationally trained all these craftspeople. But of course, none of these people actually go on and work as carpenters because they're not actually skilled enough to work as carpenters, because a lot of the game of international development is numbers. A very striking example is in Malawi. All the international donors have been boasting in Malawi about the fact that they have got 90% of young girls into 7 years of education in Malawi. None of them point out that at the end of 7 years, 85% of them are unable to read or write, because there is absolutely no focus really on the outcomes. The focus is entirely on being able to say, we have achieved our manifesto commitment of educating 100 million girls. And if you say, why are these people unable to read and write? They say, well, we're spending only $40 a head. And if you say, what would happen if we spent $80 a head? They say, well, we would educate half the number of girls. When in reality, they're educating nobody at all, right? The next problem, though, is not the issue around donor structures and coordination. It is the problem of indifference locally. And this is a much more uncomfortable situation. All of us who work in the developing world want to present ourselves as partnering incredibly closely with the local government, working with local communities, and we want to emphasize that what we are doing is the #1 priority for those communities. Sometimes that simply is not the case. This is the citadel in Ghazni. When I first saw it, I think there were 32 towers standing. There are now, I think, 19 left. That's happened less than 20 years. And why is it happening? It's happening because people have other things to worry about. Sometimes they don't care very much. It's not awfully important. Sometimes it's that developing countries' governments find themselves under extraordinary pressure, financial pressure. So in Afghanistan, for example, Mes Aynak is an incredible archaeological treasure trove. It's a valley that once contained dozens of the most extraordinary early medieval Buddhist temples in the world, an incredible complex of stupas, monasteries, sculpture, painting. It was sold by the Afghan government in a concession to the Chinese government as a copper mine for the Chinese government to extract $3.5 billion worth of copper from the valley, and in the process, destroying almost everything that remained of that site. Now, this is very understandable. These are very, very, very poor countries under enormous amount of pressure. But sometimes it is actually simple, gross irresponsibility. This is the coast of Lebanon. And I said that the period since the Second World War has been a period of cultural extinction. Nowhere is that more clear than along much of the coast of the Mediterranean. It's increasingly true along the Montenegrin coast, but it's devastatingly true along the Lebanese coast. This is part of the coast of Lebanon near Beirut. There's basically no waterfront left at all. And any attempt to try to relive the journeys of Alexander the Great or fantasize that you're following the Emperor Ramesses or the Pharaoh Ramesses as he worked his way along the coast is challenged by the fact that you're finding yourself amidst some of the shoddiest and most ill-conceived and unsustainable concrete buildings on Earth. But before we start sneering at other people's countries, we're pretty capable of doing it ourselves, right? So this is an image from Indianapolis. This is an American city showing the fantastic decisions of contemporary United States planners on what they think a great improvement in their own cultural heritage is. These two images are of the same street corner, right? The one on the top, of course, being the before shot and the bottom image being the after shot. Right, what is the solution to all of this to come to a conclusion and perhaps get some questions going? I would argue that absolutely central to the way in which we think about it is not just thinking hard about what it would mean to re-engage donors, to make governments take cultural heritage seriously, to get people to invest properly. There are schemes. It's a great scheme called Aleph, which is put together by the French government and some generous donors, including from the UAE and elsewhere in the Gulf. There was a good British fund administered by the British Council called the Cultural Protection Fund, which currently seems to be slightly withering on the vine at the moment. But these are extraordinary initiatives that people have tried over the last 5 to 10 years. And there is the extraordinary work of individuals such as the Aga Khan, who has put an incredible amount of energy and time and thought into doing this. But these are sadly exceptions to rules. One of the problems isn't just getting the money, isn't just navigating with the local host government, isn't just worrying about how you get the money out of donors. It's simply getting on with things. And that's why I want to finish with these images, because the final threat to culture is not conflict, is not the madness of the international development agencies, the indifference and competing priorities of the local governments, but it's us ourselves. It's our extraordinary tendency to pile strategy upon strategy, policy document upon policy document, and never really get on with it. I mean, all over the world, I come across buildings where an enormous amount of money is put into the study and no money has eventually been put into this individual putting a bit of mud plaster on a wall. So I want to finish with this image, right? That if we really want to think about cultural heritage preservation, we really want to think about what it can mean for a community, we need to finish with this. And we need to finish with this because what cultural heritage does is it inverts the relationship between the donor and the recipient. Traditional economic development involves foreigners, generally from the Old North, going to other people's countries and telling them what they lack, right? Saying to them, you're not healthy, you're not educated, you're not treating your women correctly, and here is a package to sort that out. They generally involve saying, we are going to try to make you more like us. But cultural heritage begins not with a deficiency, right? Not with what's lacking, but with an asset, a unique asset, something that that country has that the donor country does not have. For example, this particular courtyard building in Kabul. It gives an opportunity for the country to say, we are proud, we are in possession of a unique thing of beauty which we can share with the world, that our carpets can be exported to Restoration Harbor in New York, that our woodwork can be displayed in Asbury's, that people around the world will pay us for things which they envy, which they admire, which they will come to visit. And in doing so, help us to build the very difficult story after conflict of how you bring together people who have been fighting, who may have been fighting on the basis of different ethnicities, who may have been fighting on the basis of different religious or sectarian beliefs. Because cultural heritage represents an extraordinary chance to rediscover through tradition, through history, through memory, periods when these communities work together. This photograph that you're looking at is a photograph taken in Afghanistan about 8 years after a civil war, in which many of the individuals in that photograph were connected to militia groups that were killing each other. You will see in that photograph Pushtu men, you will also see Hazaras, you will see Tajik, you will see people who are Shia, you will see people who are Sunni, and they are together, working together on this project. But you will also see in the architecture itself, so many of those different things coming together. You will see in the shape of the arches, the Buddhist heritage of Afghanistan. In fact, the shape of a Buddhist stupa is echoed in the silhouette of that arch. You will see in the carving of the column, the connection back to Kashmiri heritage, and indeed the Mughal Empire, and the moment where Afghanistan looked to the east. But you will also see in the delicate details of the carving, the Persian heritage of Afghanistan and its connection to the West. And all of this together helps a new generation of Afghans reimagine what their country could be, reimagine the different, complicated, traditional, unexpected ways in which we combine and cooperate in the pursuit of beauty. And it's that word beauty that I want to conclude on. I've made arguments in terms of economic development and employment. I believe in them. Right? I can continue to make practical arguments for why this is an incredibly useful, important, productive way to do integrated development. But in the end, we are battling to preserve things for which we should be immensely grateful, which we've inherited from our ancestors, which we should pass on to our descendants, and which we, and indeed the people in these countries concerned, will miss terribly if they're gone. Thank you very much. Now, very happy to take questions.
Rory, thank you very much indeed for that, that very wide-ranging presentation. And I'll just go, we've got a couple of questions here already, one of which goes straight to the question that you have addressed to a degree already, but is the inevitable one that gets asked. Mohammed Hashim asks, do you think we can justify large investments in cultural heritage protection when the same amount of money could directly save lives when spent in the most financially effective ways? Now, I mean, you've made pretty clear that your answer to that question is yes, but perhaps you could elaborate on it slightly.
Well, I think there are a number of different answers to that. One is that people need to be realistic about the fact that many of the things which we think are financially effective in international development are not sustainable. So a lot of the money that we spend in international development does not actually give people real skills that actually enable them to set up a business and have a sustainable income. So a lot of the time in international development, we are thinking that we're being efficient, that we're chasing value for money, we're spending $30 a head. That feels great, but the result of it is the programs that I've seen all over the world. I've been in vocational training programs in Nigeria, where unfortunately the young men emerge at the end of the year with really no skills at all. I've seen humanitarian programs on the Pakistan border where people are trained in basket weaving and the baskets have to be burnt because nobody wants to buy them. I've seen clinics opened all over the world where there are no patients in the clinics, there are no medicines on the shelves, there are no sheets on the beds, it's just an empty building. And one of the advantages of these programs is their quality and their resilience and their sustainability. These are programs which are rooted in particular places. It's place-based development by its nature. Doesn't matter whether you're working with Humayun's tomb or whether you're working with a Roman site in northern Jordan or whether you're working in the center of the old city of Kabul. You start with a place, and in addition, you start with a community. And often the community that you're working with is a community in a very, very fragile, marginalized position. And the people that you work with have the benefit of the fact that you are often working with them for many, many years. Right? Humayun's tomb is a 20-year project. What we've been doing in Afghanistan has been going on for 15 years. That's very, very unusual in international development. Generally, an NGO will come in for 2 or 3 years and then they'll pop off again. It's their funding cycles. Right? So one of the great advantages here, if you look at our projects in Afghanistan or the Aga Khan Trust for Cultures projects elsewhere, or indeed what GIZ has been doing in Bhaktipur and Nepal, that project in Afghanistan that I showed you an image of involves the same people, both Afghan and international, spending 15 years under those buildings with the same community. And they're right there in the streets being prodded in the chest. If the clinic isn't working, people complain. If the primary school isn't working, people complain. If their house is leaking, people complain. It's deeply, deeply responsive. Right? It's the exact opposite of what we often do, which is pretend we have a plan, we're going to jump in for 2 years, spend a lot of money, and then we leave again. Culture is a patient partnership. So yes, of course, in theory, there are many other types of development that you can do. And of course, there are many other types of valuable development. I'm not going to say that we haven't achieved great things in the world. There have been extraordinary successes, for example, in HIV/AIDS in Africa, delivered by people focusing very, very narrowly on the question of healthcare. But if you wish to really do community-led development, if you really want to think about sustainable incomes, if you really want to think about how to create something where near Delhi, for example, visitor numbers go up by 1,000%, the incomes come in, the cafes are supported, the guides are supported, the gardeners are supported, the skills are communicated. That focus on place, that focus on community, and the time means that heritage-led development is often the most effective investment you can make.
Thank you. I'll go to a question that's looking sort of further forward, perhaps. What role, asks Emma Jackson, what role does technology have in future plans? I'm thinking, she says, both in terms of advantages, e.g. expanding accessibility or restitution of objects to their origins and replacing with digital alternatives, and disadvantages, for example, AI and state manipulation, increasing disparities, poor global digital democracy. What's the anchorage there to culture?
So I think that, I think the relationship of technology to cultural heritage development and preservation is not very different from the relationship of technology to development in general, which is to say, there is an enormous amount that technology has contributed, but never quite as much as the real enthusiasts in Silicon Valley like to believe, right? So, of course, it is wonderful to have these skills to be able to produce fantastic digital imagery, to be able to create extraordinary digital maps. It's extremely engaging, often to visitors, for them to be able to access different forms of media. But in the end, these buildings are old buildings in muddy places, in dangerous countries, surrounded by very poor communities. They often do not have electricity. They often don't have sanitation. And the incomes that you bring to those communities are by physically moving people there so that they can actually have a cup of tea, pay for a guide, walk around the site, stay the night. Right? So I think, I've been very proud of the work that Turquoise Mountain, for example, has done with Google Culture. And we've done some lovely work on bringing the old city of Kabul to life. And you can see that online. And of course, it's extraordinary in terms of traditional crafts. It's a very important part of heritage, how small businesses in somewhere like Afghanistan or Myanmar or Jordan can access buyers internationally and can share their designs much more easily. But this form of income for very poor people in developing countries, technology is an enabler, technology is a way of marketing, accessing new audiences, but fundamentally, people don't get incomes unless people physically turn up on the ground.
On people turning up and communities, Tim Jones, who I think is speaking from a UK perspective, comments, community-based vocational training is, of course, key to the success of the German economy. It is the issue here that we are trying to deliver to others what the UK struggles to do domestically?
I think that's a good cheeky observation. I think I'm sympathetic. We're incredibly bad at vocational training in the United Kingdom. We approach it in a very cheap, impatient fashion, and the Germans certainly do much, much better than we do. And that actually, I think, is part of the problem. But I think there's a bigger problem, which is that, that there is a fashion in international development, partly driven by the basics needs agenda of the 1970s, to put almost all the energy into primary education. So actually, it's very difficult to get donors to fund high-level vocational training in further education colleges. It's almost impossible to get them to fund universities at the moment. All the money is going towards primary education. I think that, again, is a mistake, because when you think about a society, yes, of course, teaching children basic curriculum in primary school is very important, but equally, you also need people who are university graduates and people who are highly skilled craftspeople, or it's going to be very difficult to get your economy off the ground. And I think it's a mistake donors to neglect those things. But one of the reasons they neglect them is because the reasons implicit in the question, the first question, which is that it always seems difficult to make the brave decision of investing in a university place when you can pay for many times the number of primary school places.
Thank you. Adrian Steger, who is our acting chairman at the moment, asks, how do you deal with the criticism, the so what comment, that an emphasis on culture could be viewed as patronizing by the so-called first world and maintains a population in the past, and therefore possibly with reduced economic opportunities and raised living and not the raised living standards which they want?
So I think I'm really pleased you raised that, because it is said a great deal. It tends to be said by guilty people from the West. I've never really heard it said by the communities that we actually work with on the ground. Right? If you think about these areas where we're working, so the area we were working in, Kabul with Turquoise Mountain, had 1 in 5 children dying before the age of 5, adult life expectancy of 37, no water supply, no sanitation, no electricity, no jobs, no schooling. Had we not restored that part of the historic city, the alternative was not that they were going to suddenly be able to get these wonderful kind of incomes and live in these fantastic sort of, I don't know, some sort of fancy loft apartment in Covent Garden as their alternative, right? The truth of the matter is that generally people who speak like this have a very little understanding of what the actual options available to communities are. And the real people who benefit generally from destroying historic heritage are not the poor. It's usually the rich property developers. The biggest pressure on these sites is almost never from local communities who are frequently deeply proud of these places, have grown up amongst them, live with them, and can see that if you put the investment right, they have long-term sustainable incomes that they can derive from it. Generally, the threat, if it's indigenous, is from outsiders, and they're usually people who are coming in because they want to build an apartment complex, or they want to build a highway, and sure as eggs, the first thing they do is evict the entire local community that are living there in the name of development. So it's the rougher, more brutal side of globalization that is actually the alternative to working patiently with communities on culture.
I'm going to group together 3 questions here, which overlap, not entirely, but to an extent. They are all basically about persuading those who have the power to do things to do these things. First of all, and this is a perspective from Ireland, how do you persuade governments to value heritage artifacts for their own sake, rather than leave them to rot because they represent an overthrown ruling class. How do you shift international development more generally to recognize the cultural, the importance of the cultural element? And how can donors be persuaded to adapt their funding approaches to support longer term commitments? I mean, I guess part of the answer to that last one is to have the right Secretary for International Development, but unfortunately circumstances prevented that.
So thank you. So I think the first thing is you're absolutely right. I mean, the Irish question is a good one because, of course, some of the challenge to cultural heritage traditionally has been through forms of cultural revolution. And actually, there is a direct connection between the phenomenon that you're referring to in Ireland and indeed the Cultural Revolution in China, where quite deliberately the Red Guards set out to destroy objects. But here is an image, which I think I skipped over, of this theme. Let me just get to it. Yeah. Coming up. Second. And in a sense, the Taliban are in the same tradition. I mean, they are. This is China and the Cultural Revolution, but it's not a very long way. I mean, of course, in that picture, they're actually destroying Buddhas for a slightly different reason from the reason in which these guys are destroying Buddhas. But it is true that in many cases, although tradition and culture can be a very strong reminder of a peaceful past where people live together, it can also be associated in people's minds with elites that they wish to escape. And you can see the National Trust in Britain has been going through a lot of problems over the last 4 or 5 years, trying to work out how to present its own houses, right? Which understandably for some people are seen as symbols of elitism, of aristocracy, of colonialism, of empire, and even of slavery. Right? So it's never an easy question dealing with the past. How can donors adjust to this? Well, I think firstly, there needs to be a very clear instruction from the top that we care about these things, that economic development cannot purely be, or development cannot purely be about reducing everything to GDP per capita. There are things that matter and will matter in these countries that go a long way beyond have we or have we not managed to increase by 20 cents GDP per capita income. And that is true because we need to take the long view. We can feel this with the environment, right? We've grasped the fact that in relation to climate and the environment, it's not good enough to just say, well, this project is developing things, so I don't care that my dam is destroying an entire ecosystem, or this agricultural scheme is poisoning the entire landscape, or, you know, economic development in Brazil involves cutting down the rainforest and putting cattle in a way that degrades soil, right? We get that. We get that it's not a trump card to just say, well, some people are making money out of this, so it's fine. We need to develop the same respect and deference for our cultural heritage that we have for our environmental heritage. And we need to develop the same sensitivity to human landscapes that we have to wild landscapes, and understand that our meaning, our happiness, our joy as humans are connected to those things, and that it should not just be a luxury for wealthy countries, because often the very people who are attacking cultural development programs abroad are very comfortably enjoying the fact that in Britain, the National Trust has bought up 750 miles of the coastline through Project Neptune, preventing people from doing exactly what is happening in Lebanon, right? And that many of these things were done in our countries at times when actually our GDPs were much lower. Right? We were buying up that coastline when the GDP per capita in Britain was lower than the GDP per capita in Ghana today. Right? And if you don't do it then and leave it, right, till everybody's reached the income levels of the United States, there will be nothing left of this stuff. And then you will be living in a country where you may not want to live. I mean, any of you on this call who like walking along the British coastline or seeing any part of protected landscape or seeing any historic buildings left, right, need to understand that these happened because brave people like Octavia Hill in the 1870s and 80s went out and fought for these things against people who said, industrialization, modernity, progress, efficiency, we must flatten all these things because we must make money.
That is, I think, the point at which we are going to have to close for today. Challenging though it is, and there are a number of questions that we're just not going to reach. I apologize to those for whom there isn't time. Thank you very much indeed, Rory. It was a wonderful talk. There's been a very lively discussion going on the chat channel during all of this as well, and I hope that the audience have got something out of that too. One of the contributors to the chat channel has asked if there is a newsletter that they can subscribe to or a program that they can receive for the next year, and the answer to that is yes. You can go to the Royal Society for Asian Affairs website, where you can sign up for the newsletter. We will also follow up to this this event with a one-off email to those of you who are new to us. Our program for 2022 will start to appear on the RSAA website soon, but as Jonathan already mentioned, the next talk in this series will be on the 2nd of February, when Mo Saita will be talking about the role of sport and the arts in promoting social cohesion in Iraq, that very same theme that Rory has been talking about now. And I'd like to thank Rory Stewart, Jonathan Ryder and Matt Reed very much indeed for their participation today, and wish you all well for Christmas and the New Year, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.